Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Svitlana Biedarieva, who is an award-winning art historian, artist, and curator. She has conducted research on Ukraine's decolonization, as well as the documentation of the war in Ukrainian art. Her recent edited books include Contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic Art, Political and Social Perspectives, 1991 to 2021, and At the Frontline, Ukrainian Art 2013 to 2019, co-edited with Hanna Deikun. She received her PhD in History of Art from the Courtauld Institute of Art, part of the University of London. Svitlana, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for inviting me. It's a big pleasure for me to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
That's great. And I think this is a subject I'm particularly interested in. I think it's one which is very much overlooked, certainly in the mainstream media. And we're going to try and bring this video to life a bit by putting some examples of the artists and work that you're going to discuss here. So for the audience, watch out for the links and for the images of the artists. So describe a little bit, where are you now and what has been your experience of the war so far?
I'm currently in Mexico City. I work here at the university, and this kind of positioning in Mexico City, I think, influenced my recent interest in the important topic of decolonization in Ukraine. Because Latin America provided this very important and interesting framework of decolonial theory. So now what I'm trying to do, kind of drawing on my experience here in Mexico, and particularly the exhibitions that I did here in 2019, which was called At the Frontline, Ukrainian Art 2013-2019, and which showed actually that some parallels and some discussions can be made through the notions of violence, through the notions of displacement, on discussions about identity as reflected in contemporary art. This experience of the practical experience of the exhibition and my interest in decolonial theory led me to my research on Ukraine's decoloniality as expressed in Ukraine's art and the process of decolonization that is currently ongoing since the outbreak of the war in 2014, but which went significantly faster after 2022.
And it's interesting that you're in Mexico, of course, a country that has suffered from a colonial past and gone through that process of trying to break out of that. Do you find people understand that this is a war where Ukraine is a former colony and this is essentially an imperial war? Or do people, I'm talking very generally here, does the Russian propaganda line that this is a civil war, that you're fraternal people, blah, 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 does that kind of narratives, do you still hear that sometimes? Is there a difficulty understanding that this is actually a war of colonization?
It is sometimes needed to explain it because, and there are several reasons for it. For example, the first reason is that Ukraine is not a typical case of these colonial relations. If you think about most of empires, they created their colonies through conquest in distant territories, and therefore there was a significant geographical distance and also cultural distance. And this process of integration, this process of syncretism, was going kind of more visibly in those cases. In the case with Ukraine and Russia, there is a shared border, and mutual influences filtered over this border for centuries. With the presence of border or without, but there was always this exchange, and therefore for many people who are acquainted with this classical model of colonialism, they don't regard Ukraine as a colonial case, but in practice my work currently, and that of my colleagues, of course, is directed to wider understanding why there was coloniality present in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine for centuries, and how we can actually dissolve this coloniality through cultural processes.
And there's also an interesting case, isn't it? And this really took me a long time to really understand and appreciate, because again, in this sort of classic imperial model, if you have an appropriation of a culture or its art, you can point to that. It's fairly distinct, you know, whether that's Chinese art in the 18th century or, you know, various Indian influences in English art. It kind of stands out very, very clearly that it's another culture that you are absorbing and perhaps sort of doing something with. In this instance, the colonial power actually appropriated or seems to have appropriated a part of its identity from its colonial subject. And that colonial subject was in itself at some time, you know, quite a major power, which then came to be dominated by you know, you know, Muscovy, which we're talking about here. Does that also sort of complicate things? You know, the very idea of Russia taking the name Rus and many other examples, it's quite a strange case of appropriation, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And while these cases of appropriation we can observe throughout centuries, of course, the most visible for us because of temporal proximity, but also because of the volume of this appropriation is the case of 20th century Russia as part of the Soviet Union. And of course the post-Soviet condition that relates to this history. And the most prominent example of artistic practices that were appropriated by Russia, of course, is so-called Russian avant-garde, which is a label that currently is challenged by Ukrainian art historians and also by some Western art historians because it doesn't fully reflect the situation. The artists of avant-garde were many of Ukrainian origin, and many of them, they were born in Ukraine, and some of them, they worked in Ukraine at some part of their careers. And but the way of presenting their art influenced by Russian domination in the cultural sphere of many years and decades, is that they were Russian artists. And that, unfortunately, we still can find in Western collections. For example, in one recent museum, I saw a label of the work of Alexander Archipenko, who was described as born in Kyiv, with IE, Russia, now Kyiv, with YI, Ukraine. And that was some very particular case that I never saw before, that the word Kyiv was actually spelled into as a copy from two different languages, from Russian and Ukrainian, in order to describe this. But this is the discrepancy that occurs in Western collections that needs to be actually corrected. And currently, the work of Ukrainian art historians is directed to this, to find the appropriate niche for Ukrainian artists and the proper description of their legacy as belonging to Ukrainian cultural sphere. And in this way, to return visibility to Ukrainian culture that was overlooked for many years.
And that label betrays an extraordinary confusion, doesn't it? But it's not just confusion and ignorance that leads galleries to put these labels. Some of them are now acutely aware that their labeling reflects a sort of imperial narrative as opposed to being more nuanced. And yet, large institutions tend to have, you know, sometimes issues with resources, but they also have a bureaucratic inertia as well to making change. So what do you think are the biggest challenges for decolonizing Western collections which contain Ukrainian artists?
I think that this decolonization process in terms of museum practice is directly related to the creation of new knowledge in research. And here we find a deeper problem, a problem of domination of Russian studies in the field for kind of long-standing domination of Russian studies, which needs to also to be in a way challenged, because we need to find the proper place for Ukrainian studies in this picture of the world. There are few Ukrainian studies programs, for example. There is a lack of them. There is a lack of English language texts, particularly in my area, in history of art, for example. There are not enough texts produced about Ukrainian art. And the situation is improving. There are more courses appearing at different levels, undergraduate, postgraduate levels, in Western universities that focus on different aspects of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian society, Ukrainian culture. But this process started after 2022, and until now I see it as a kind of sporadic process. There are some initiatives emerging, but because they don't have this kind of long-standing intention or some more fundamental basis, they appear and then they're short term and then they disappear. And this is something that needs to be changed in order to integrate Ukraine into Western research, and subsequently, or in parallel with that, integrate also Ukrainian art in Western collections with proper attribution and proper tribute to Ukrainian legacy in the production of this art.
And one of the, I think, most infamous examples of that, and I have to admit I was very ignorant of that, and that is the great artist Ilya Repin, whose output, extraordinary output, and, you know, it's got a kind of, his paintings have a kind of life to them, not just in the sort of faces and expressions, but he's done huge panoramas, and there's something extraordinary in his images. Now, of course, I, until recently, wasn't aware of his origins in Ukraine, the fact he was trained in Ukraine, born in Ukraine, and with some validity can be described as a Ukrainian artist. And, you know, looking at his letters and you know, so on to relatives and friends, I think it's clear that he identified as such. As late as January 2022, the major retrospective exhibition in Paris was called Ilya Repin, Russian Soul. So these kind of this you know, that obviously is also a commercial decision there. It comes out of ignorance, but also it's a commercial decision in that they almost certainly thought that it's going to get more attention. It's going to sell more tickets because you know, it's people have more awareness of that. How, you know, do you think that's going to change now? I mean, that ended in January 2022. The next month, of course, the full-scale invasion began. Do you think we will not see those kind of exhibition titles again being, you know, so completely wrong?
I think this requires much work, because this inertia continues in academic circles and also in museum circles. And for example, one of the recent examples is the exhibition of Futemas of the Russian, this Russian avant-garde college that focused particularly in architecture, and the exhibition was to be held at the Cooper Union in New York. And because of kind of widespread opposition to presentation of this exhibition, it was postponed, but nevertheless it opened in late April. And I think there was a misunderstanding between those researchers who were opposing this exhibition and those who supported it, because there was this letter of support signed by 700 people or more. I think that this precise point of divergence between the two groups was that, from one side, Ukrainian scholars talked about this precise use of references to Russia, such as the notion of Russian avant-garde, as an umbrella for practices of Ukrainian artists. And therefore, the participation of works by Ukrainian artists, such as Nathan Altman or Anatol Petritsky in this exhibition, was seen as an inappropriate, because in this way they were precisely contextualized in this Russian cultural sphere. And from those who wrote this the letter opposing supporting the exhibition, they remarked precisely in the inclusion of Ukrainian artists that they were not excluded, but they were included. And I think this is precisely this presents this discrepancy, this rupture in understanding of how actually Ukrainian art looks for Ukrainian art historians look for recognition of Ukrainian art as such. But Western academia omits this vision somehow. And yes, I think that this process is going to be changing, but much explanation is needed. Why, for example, it is not it is not correct, especially in a wartime, to present Ukrainian artists within Russian art school. And this will require much work.
It's a difficult subject, isn't it? Because I know in literary sort of groups have a similar problem, and they very early on, PEN, the writers' organization in Ukraine, said that they would not be sharing a platform with any Russian writers for the duration of the war, simply to avoid these kind of situations. So very, very simple kind of policy. There are, of course, those who will say that art and, say, sport should not be politicized. But actually, that is to ignore that culture and art have been a key tool in the projection of soft Russian power and hard imperial power as well. And it can't be forgotten as well that Russia has not just bombed clinics and hospitals, not just bombed power and energy infrastructure, it has also purposefully destroyed museums, collections, artist houses, and actually caused the death of many prominent Ukrainian artists during this full-scale war.
Yes, absolutely. And this process of destruction of museums and killing Ukrainian artists during this ongoing war, also it echoes some situations in the past. For example, if we think about Soviet time repression of the artists of executed Renaissance, the so-called movement of executed Renaissance in the 1930s, when, for example, the entire circle of Mikhailo Baichuk, including his colleagues and his students, was killed by Stalinist regime, and this was not. And many of their murals and their works were destroyed. Or then there was the return of the situation with the generation of the 60s, when the artist Alagorska was killed under some very mysterious circumstances. And the reason why she was killed is because she began exploring the mass graves that were found near Bykivnya, and she tried to prove, together with other intellectuals from the 60th generation, that this was the mass graves of the victims of NKVD, of Soviet secret services. And in this way, also there was this continuity of repression of Ukrainian intellectuals. And this is one of the reasons also why Ukrainian culture didn't receive enough attention until now, because many of works of the artists, subsequently to their deaths, they were destroyed as well. For example, there is this special fund in the collections of the National Museum of Art in Ukraine that gathers the works that they were not on display for decades because they were deemed as some kind of not kind of opposing Soviet regime. And it was lucky that they survived, even if they were in horrible conditions. Some of them, they were without stretchers. They were just one canvas wrapped over another canvas on a roll, and it took really big effort for the museum to restore them, and the process is still ongoing. But this shows this particular attitude towards Ukrainian cultural heritage in the Soviet times. And we can make precisely this parallel of repression in the Soviet time and the military aggression towards kind of pointed and directed military aggression towards Ukrainian museums and Ukrainian cultural heritage as of situation of now, of the war.
So not only is Ukrainian sort of culture seen as secondary or inconsequential, and that obviously was carried through the Soviet period, what we are also seeing, and this is very interesting, you've written about the influence of the war on writers, and I know you did some interviews just prior to the full-scale war, and you said that actually there was a strong sense of premonition of catastrophe in many of the interviews you conducted with prominent artists. Does that also come across in works of art between 2014 and 2022?
Actually, I conducted interview for October Journal and this was published in January 2022. And the artists who I talked with, they all didn't believe that the invasion will happen. Because somehow there was this widespread belief in Ukraine that Russia will not attack, because even despite all this aggressive action starting 2014, the full-scale aggression was seen as impossible by many. And everyone from these artists, who included Alevtina Kahidze, Piotr Raminovsky, Andrei Dosliev, Lia Dosleva, Maria Kulikovska, they somehow really didn't believe this, and at least as I interpreted it, and it reflected on the general condition of Ukrainian society. So the full-scale invasion of 2022 came in some part as a surprise, and very, very, very bad surprise.
And quite a few of the people I've spoken to, I mean, similarly, a lot of Ukrainians I've spoken to have that same sense of shock. What they also say is they don't want to be living in a history. You know, they don't want to have this incredibly huge pivotal moment in history necessarily happening in their lifetimes, but it is. So of course, you know, they need to deal with it. But not only is this some terrible echo of the past, doesn't it also feel that this is perhaps a culmination of centuries of violence against Ukraine, and that actually this is where it has to stop? You know, Russia has to be beaten once and for all, so that no future generation has to go through this.
In my research, I speak about Ukraine's decoloniality from a particular point of view. That there is the post-colonial stage that Ukraine entered in 1991, and which involved a combination of all these elements of the past into some kind of new narratives, rethought narratives, and then there is a decolonial stage of final release from these post-colonial narratives and creation of completely new ones and disentangled ones. And while in 2014 Ukraine showed some movement towards this decolonial situation, it was fully actualized by the events of the invasion of 2022, because precisely of this very paradigmatic shift of understanding of Ukraine's relationship with Russia, and the understanding of necessity of breaking up completely with these past notions that link Ukraine to Russia. And that's how we see the emergence of many new disentangled narratives in post-2022 Ukrainian art, which aims to create some new knowledge through addressing, in this case, the war, for example, creating the archive of the war and rethinking this war, and relying also on personal experiences of the artists, relying on the documentation. And this is something new that we can observe in cultural processes, and which reflect, of course, on wider social processes in Ukrainian society after 2022. And this process, as it is ongoing, eventually will lead to a decolonial release from this post-colonial situation, and also it will have wider influence on the situation of the post-Soviet space. So we are currently seeing that post-Soviet space as a notion is falling apart, because all these aggressive movements of Russia, they created this particular transformation that is already irreversible. And post-colonial situation and post-Soviet space are the notions that are already in the past, while Ukraine is in process now of creating its own history and placing itself into this new history.
I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? It's, you know, people generally in Ukraine are bilingual, and almost everyone will understand Russian. Most people sort of speak it fluently. And until, you know, Crimea, in fact, not until the full-scale invasion, did people really try to move beyond, you know, Russian, or the very idea of speaking Russian almost becomes kind of painful to many people. But this is not what Russia says it is. You know, it says that this is Russophobia, but what they've done is they've created that sort of allergic reaction to Russian culture through the violence that you've just talked about.
I personally, I don't see language as some kind of marker of post-coloniality. Although, of course, there is this relation, if you think about colonialism in Latin America and the domination of Spanish over and Portuguese over indigenous languages, for example, there is this connotation of this colonial domination by language. But I think is also a channel, merely a channel that carries these post-colonial notions. And my personal approach to this is that while challenging the domination of Russian culture in Ukraine, it is also needed to understand that there is this division between the language and all this cultural element that it carries, and act accordingly. So it is kind of it is a complex question. As an art historian, I don't feel ready to to respond it in full, at least now. But I think that the linguistic situation in Ukraine is more complex as to be merely reduced to this parallel that, okay, Russian literature, Russian language, Russian culture. No, we need to distinguish like tools and content, or that is transmitted by those tools. Yes, at least this, and this, I think, will needs to be analyzed and needs to be interpreted already with some time distance, with some kind of detachment from the situation. When this detachment will come is difficult to say, because we don't know when the war of Russia will end. So, but at this stage, I prefer to address only this level where the content is created. That's why I speak about artistic practices and some kind of more like literary practices related to this artistic practices and so on.
And that's an interesting point, I think, because in many ways people are feeling traumatized. People are feeling all sorts of emotions and experiences which are sometimes difficult to express in words. But art as a visual medium, do you think that has the power actually to express many of these traumatic experiences and things people are going through?
Yes, And art has played very important role since 2014, passing through different stages. But precisely detaching from all this polarized linguistic situation, for example, as a visual medium or as audiovisual medium as well. Since 2014, there was this a shift towards documentation, which was the immediate result of the fact that many of the artists proceeding from the east and south of the country, they needed to move to other parts of the country, being displaced because of the war. And these artists, they tried to bring some kind of understanding of what's going on in these occupied territories or in the adjacent front line to a wider public. And that's how we see this complete explosion of a diversity of documentary practices between 2014 and 2022. And they were kind of particular type that aimed to be kind of a translation of the traumatic events to the audiences that are not that much in touch with these events, both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And in 2022, we see a change towards artists' personal chronicles, because with all this radical full-scale invasion and all these atrocities that affected the life of everyone in Ukraine, there was no more need to be a conduit in a way, but there was a need of a dialogue with people who had shared similar experiences of shellings, of violence, of all this military threats, and that was brought by this full-scale invasion. And that's how artists, they tried kind of to connect to people's experiences through such genres, for example, as personal diary, as we see in the works of Alevtina Kahidze, of Vlada Ralko, of Evgenia Belorusets, and many other artists. We see this change between kind of reported speech and direct speech of the direct witnesses of violence. And then there was this other turn also in Ukrainian art in the second half of 2022, when Ukrainian society started to know more about all the war crimes that occurred in the spring of 2022 with all these people who were killed brutally, the civilians, those who were found in the mass graves, and all this comprehension of this kind of unbelievable evil. It turned artists to some kind of reflection on such topics as violence, the bodily agency of the victims of war crimes, kind of questions of corporeality and the right to this corporeality. And these are the works also that become kind of more radical in their expression, and they refer to this particular kind of more intimate levels of interpretation already. The speaking about human body and kind of personal agency in having those bodies. And I think that was kind of this also some kind of stage in between like the second half of 2022 and the beginning of 2023. And undoubtedly now there should be some kind of other turn of production of Ukrainian art ongoing, but of course the results we will see with some small delay in some small time distance. But what I want to say is that also in comparison with this long period between 2014 and 2022, and this focus on documentation in that period, there is kind of much more rapid change, which reflects in the creation of artistic work, that reflects on the increased production of narratives. And this is something that contributes to the coloniality of Ukrainian culture, because if we listen to decolonial scholars, they say that the colonial project is predominantly an epistemological project, is project of creating a new knowledge. And we see kind of through the lens of art, we see that this new knowledge is increasingly being created now in Ukraine.
And clearly all of this violence and trauma is being inflicted upon Ukraine. It's not necessarily a theme which Ukrainian artists would choose if they weren't living through these times. It's because of this history that's been imposed upon them. Do you think there's a sort of natural tension, and is it creative in some ways, between these themes that artists are forced to grapple with and other themes of Ukrainian life, which I was speaking to a well-known YouTuber, and she said, well, there are things Ukrainians actually, they're not a miserable people. Naturally, Ukrainians like food, they like comfort, they like dancing, they like music. Generally, they've got an optimistic, future-oriented way of looking at the world. And here you've got this sort of juxtaposition of really dark themes from the darkest points in history bubbling up in the present. Do you feel these sort of contrasts in the art that is emerging?
Yes, of course, and many of good examples of art. Of course, I work on the contrast between extreme aggression and the peaceful life. For example, I can think about this recent exhibition at Bogdan and Varvara Hanenko Museum, which was called Meanwhile in the Hanenko House. And they needed to evacuate all the works from the museum, which hosts Ukraine's most prominent collection of Western art and also of Western European art, and also of Oriental art. So because there was a missile that fell in front of the museum in April 2022 and damaged the facade and the windows, and there was a children playground there, luckily without children at that moment, that got completely destroyed. And what the museum decided to do in March of this year, they exhibited contemporary art to fill this space. And this contemporary art was of very particular order. There were site-specific installations, but many of them, as I noted, they were focused on precisely these elements of peaceful life that were set as ready-made objects into these empty display cases or empty frames found inside of a museum. And they were kind of like these small elements that were reminiscent of peaceful life of past relationships of the artists, for their past friendships or current friendships, and some gifts, some small objects like, for example, like shoes or a vase or a cup, or like kind of banal objects of everyday living, incorporated in this display cases of the museum. It was one of the installations I'm talking about is installation by Stanislav Turina, and this created this particular feeling of emptiness and the lack of kind of grand works of art. And at the same time, this particular tension that was expressed as nostalgia by this everyday object that mark our connection to life and to our kind of habitual surroundings. And those that they became already an artifact that need to be exhibited in the museum because they're so kind of rare, because the natural order of life is disrupted. So I think that was a really great exhibition that precisely showed this tension.
And this is quite an abstract question, and this may be difficult to answer, but it seems to me that Ukraine does not need Russia in order to complete it, or in order to drive its sort of experiment in identity. Whereas Russia seems to have made Ukraine a key part of its identity, and territories that belong to Ukraine a key part of Russian identity. So when Russia talks about, the West trying to destroy Russian culture, I think they genuinely believe it, because they genuinely believe that Ukraine is an indivisible part of Russia's identity. And if that's going to be taken away, if Belarus also, gets taken away, then somehow, Russia is lessened by this process. Do you think there's something in that?
I think that this is a very interesting phenomenon which hasn't been addressed previously in any kind of theory addressing colonialism. Neither in post-colonial theory is fully this idea of this kind of mutual entanglement is fully developed, nor in decolonial theory, because they operate more of this kind of binary oppositions, and like the idea of dominating power and the oppressor and the oppressed. In the case of Ukraine, I think what is needed is for developing a new methodology and new theories that would be applicable. And I'm currently working on a book called Ambicoloniality and War, the Ukrainian-Russian case, and is a working title. And it will be published in the end of this year. And precisely in this book, I'm still kind of in the process of of elaborating the entire argument, but I address this phenomenon of Russia's profound interest or Russia's identity construction through Ukrainian, this addressing to Ukraine. And I think that this is very important kind of notion that I describe as a notion of ambicoloniality, but in a more symbolic way. Like there is coloniality as this very pragmatic situation of domination and oppression, and but also it connotes some kind of symbolic obsession of Russia with Ukrainian territory. So where this colonialism spreads over the border, but in a different way, without Ukraine's intention, of course, of dominating Russia's symbolic field. But it's still a project in progress, so I cannot speak more about it. But yes, you're absolutely right, and this is a very unique situation that I think will be described in the subsequent years by many colleagues, many researchers who will address this topic.
No, I definitely look forward to reading about that. It's as you say, this process is quite unique. As a Russian historian, Alexander Etkin, who calls it internal colonization, and of course, Ukraine is not the only nationality encompassed by the Russian Empire. And of course, in previous generations, artists and writers especially, they had a challenge, didn't they? Either they stay in Ukraine and they write within a sort of national sort of framework, or they go and they work partially in the service of the empire or the imperial project. And I know if you compare Taras Shevchenko and Gogol, then they take different paths there. You can't call necessarily Gogol an imperial writer, but he chose to write on, the themes of, say, St. Petersburg, the imperial city, the administration, and so on. Did similar challenges exist for visual artists as well in the 19th century?
Yes, and Taras Shevchenko, he was also, for example, a visual artist, and the things that what we see since the 19th century and subsequently towards already the dismantling of the Soviet Union is the particular type of post-colonial hybridity. In that case, colonial, and then already subsequently post-colonial hybridity, which is this combination of narratives of belonging to the dominant culture and the oppressed culture, and precisely this current decolonial situation that we are witnessing is aiming to dismantle this hybridity. But hybridity doesn't come alone. It comes, according to the post-colonial theory, it comes hand in hand with ambivalence. And ambivalence is a related notion which shows how the oppressor regards themselves as through the lens of the oppressed culture, and vice versa. It's like this kind of permanent internal tension between the two cultures that creates this kind of very doubled point of view on the world, like all this kind of Janus-faced appearance of all this perspective. And this is something that is also currently disappearing, as we see in the visual art of Ukrainian artists now. But this is something that has continuity undoubtedly from all the efforts of Russia to oppress Ukrainian culture, and of course we can link it to the 19th century as well.
Well, my last question is going to end on perhaps a sort of a slightly negative note, and I think it's appropriate because going back to one of the first things we said is that Russia's war has targeted cultural institutions. It has targeted art collections. When the war is over and Ukraine is victorious, what is going to be the scale of losses? And should art form a prominent part of the reconstruction effort in subsequent years?
It's difficult to evaluate what will be the scale of losses because the war is still ongoing, and as we see, the aggression still continues. And although, of course, the intensity of the war in comparison with the previous year is not that intensive, but of course it can be quite a continuous process. And in this sense, what art can contribute to this is to be a tool of resistance, as it is now, is to be a tool of rethinking and old identities and constructing new identities. It can be a tool of resilience and support to Ukrainian society. It can be also a conduit of all these transformations inside of Ukrainian society and all the situation to the outer world, to international sphere. And I think that after the war finishes, art will take a very important role in precisely formation of our visions of how Ukrainian society needs to function further after the war finishes, and also it will contribute greatly to the reconstruction of Ukraine, because precisely as I mentioned, this approach of constructing the coloniality through constructing new knowledge or constructing epistemological basis, art is a very important element in this process of construction and, of course, reconstruction.
And of course, art galleries and the combination of, say, cafes and art galleries and so on, they can form a sort of community around them. It can also help to sort of rebuild societies and communities, not just, physical spaces.
Yes, and one important aspect of Ukraine's transformation in the latest years is institutional transformation, which was fostered precisely by the events of 2014, both by Euromaidan protests and all these considerations brought about by Euromaidan protests, and the subsequent occupation of part of Ukraine by Russia. And that's how I think the more profound understanding of necessity of support to art and culture and decentralization, particularly of this cultural production, emerged. And that's how certain governmental efforts were presented, such as, for example, Ukrainian Institute or Ukrainian Cultural Foundations that between 2018 and 2022 supported precisely this cultural decentralization in different regions of Ukraine, and also related increase of activity of non-profits and grassroots organizations in different regions. And this is something that produced very good support already in the situation of the full-scale invasion 2022, because, for example, many of organizations in the west of the country, they hosted displaced artists from the occupied territories, of the newly occupied territories, and even they hosted the entire displaced kind of initiative, larger scale initiatives. As for example, I always give the example of Kherson Contemporary Art Museum, which is practically a private initiative. But the founder of this initiative, he disappeared in October 2022 in the Kherson region. And until now, his whereabouts are not known. So it might be that something very bad happened to him. And many of the artists who were displaced from Kherson region, they were hosted by organizations in the west of Ukraine. And that increases precise exchange inside cultural practices of different regions and enriches these cultural practices and helps to decentralization of these practices. And also it increases what I call internal hybridization, as opposed to this post-colonial internal, which helps kind of deeper connection between different regional artistic ways of artistic production. And this is also, I think, one of important changes brought about by the war, and those that they contribute to the decolonization in Ukraine.
Well, Svitlana, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and it sort of fills me with a sense of optimism, actually. Not only that art is helping Ukraine to be resilient, but that is going to help in the future to develop, a strong national identity and keep that sense of resilience and resistance strong. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to reading the paper or the book that you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting me.